Is India's constitution a colonial document? Is it time to debate the constitution and not simply worship it? Remember, the constitution was once described as his holy book by Prime Minister Modi. But a provocative new book argues that the Constitution of India does not need blind faith. Instead, it needs renewed engagement and renewed debate. The debate around this provocative new book that calls the Constitution Colonial has quite literally set the cat among the pigeons. Its author, the director of the Vidhi Legal Policy Group, has argued that he's not calling for a rewriting of the Constitution, but he does believe that India needs to debate some new constitutional ideas. Joining us now is the author himself, Arghya Sengupta, a lawyer, author, and a thinker. And as I said, Arghya, your argument has quite literally led to a lot of pushback, with people saying that the one document that is kind of the holy grail of India, that the Prime Minister called his holy book, that is the one sacred document that is seen to have held this otherwise diverse country together. Many people believe that you're calling for a rewriting or a relook at the fundamentals of the Constitution. But that's not what you're saying, are you?
No. So my book, as the subtitle of it describes it, is an origin story of the Constitution. It goes back to the founding of the Constitution to look at the ideas that animated the framers of the document. And in my view, if there is one thing that was a consensus across the board, across all framers of the Constitution, is that the Constitution should not be worshipped. It is not a document that, in your words, as you said, is sacred. It is something that needs to be engaged with at all points of time. That is how it remains dynamic. And when they're talking about engagement, it's not just engagement by lawyers and judges. That's, of course, part of their job in the Supreme Court and the High Courts. But engagement by ordinary people, because at the end of the day, the Constitution is in the name of the people. So what my book does is that, yes, it has a provocative title, and that is deliberate, because I want people to think for themselves about the Constitution and not think that this is something for lawyers and judges to decide and debate.
But one of the central arguments for your suggesting that the roots of the Constitution are colonial is the Government of India Act 1935. And you trace the structural framework of the Indian Constitution back to what was, of course, a British era act. But, Arghya, wouldn't that be somewhat like saying that the parliamentary democracy system, the Westminster system, as we were taught in our civics books, is today colonial, because actually it was an idea that was borrowed from the British? The fact is that the Constitution may have derived from a sort of colonial era framework, but it has been Indianized. It has been sort of changed. It has been readapted to a free country that, in fact, gave many more individual rights, including, by the way, rights to women, that many other democracies around the world took decades to get to.
Absolutely. So just to say that something is colonial doesn't mean that there aren't other parts of the Constitution as well which are very original and very empowering. And in my book, I do talk about several of those. But why do I say it's colonial? It's not simply because it's based on the Government of India Act. The Government of India Act was chosen because it existed at the time as a document that most of the freedom fighters had worked with for the last 15 years, because it had functioned as the de facto constitution. And they were men and women in a hurry. And instead of starting on a actual clean slate, they decided to start with the Government of India Act. So it's not just a point that they started with the Government of India Act, but there are three key reasons that I provide in my book as to why I think it's colonial. Number one, why is the Constitution so long? We were told in our civics classes that, we have the longest Constitution in the world. But why is that? That's not random. That's because of the fact that the Constitution framers wanted to lay out in painstaking detail every aspect of governance in the country. And why did they want to do that? They wanted to do that because they felt that people were not ready for democracy. Now, this, in my view, as unsettling as it may be, is a holdover from the colonial times where the natives could not be trusted. So you need law to bind the natives. And I think we've got some variant of that at play, again, with very good intentions, but that's the idea, number one. Number two, and Barkha, you've done more reporting on this than many others, and thankfully so. This is something that the media and the legal fraternity have to do, is to ensure protection of rights. Now, but at the end of the day, the Constitution gives all these wonderful rights that you're talking about, but there is a range of restrictions on those rights. And that we can say, is because of A government or B government, but not a single government in independent India wants to do away with the crime against sedition. Not a single government in independent India wants to do away with preventive detention. And why is that? Because they find ballast for these arguments in the Constitution itself. Because the Constitution, despite giving the fundamental right to personal life and liberty in a very curious provision. So Article 21 is the right to life and personal liberty. Article 22 of the Constitution legitimizes preventive detention that allows the state to detain citizens without charge. So this is the second broad reason as to why it's colonial. And the third is that it perpetuates colonial institutions. And I think this is a very critical point that we need to think about, that in 1947, the Constitution framers had a choice. If it was a genuinely new beginning, then we had to think, as Gandhiji was saying, as to what kind of decentralized forms of governance instinctive to India can we think about. Instead, the constitutional framers went for stability. I'm not saying that this was an unreasonable choice, but it was a choice. And the way they went for stability is by continuing colonial institutions. So the Imperial Police Service, responsible for a lot of the brutality of the British Raj, immediately overnight, same officers becomes the Indian Police Service, which is enshrined in the Constitution. Now, a tiger can't change its stripes overnight, and that is why the police today, and with great respect I say this, continue to function as a colonial police force.
Okay, a lot to unpack there. Let's start with your idea of the paternalistic state, a state that has been given far too many powers. You think that there is some subliminal leftover there of needing to control, quote unquote, the natives. But let's argue it the other way. If you look at reform, legal reform, the decriminalizing of homosexuality, for example, all of it has been interpreted within the existing articles of the Constitution. Like any religious text even, which was written in a certain place and context, these are dynamic texts, and a lot depends on how you interpret them. So, for example, you have the present Chief Justice, Justice Chandrachud, having passed a landmark judgment on the rights of an individual to privacy. And he interprets all of this within the right to, equality, for example. Article 14 has been, in a way, so open-ended that today you can introduce a lot of change within the existing tenets. Do you not think, therefore, that was quite foresighted and there's already enough elasticity within the Constitution?
Yes. So I think that I'll answer this in two ways. The first is that I think words by their very nature are elastic, right? So there is always interpretation, and you can take something that is conservative and you can make it more liberal. And I think the Supreme Court of India and many high courts has done that largely over the course of the last 75 years, and great credit to them for doing that. But my book is more about that starting point. And that starting point need not have been this way. Let me give you a very simple example. One of the things that the framers of the Constitution were bothered about at the time was education, right? As in the literacy rate was about 17% in the country, give or take a little bit at that point of time. And they wanted to do something in the Constitution that ensures that people are educated. Now, if you were to think genuinely with a clean slate, and I think a lot of it, what I'm arguing, may be seen as extra constitutional, but maybe you are looking at how can I fund greater public education in the country? What do I need to do to ensure that girl children are in school? And can I think of the Constitution very differently, that it has this set of provisions about funding of education, about incentives for people to come to school, etc., etc. But they don't do that. What do? They say that, there should be a right to education, But because we don't have the money today, we are going to put it in the directive principles because at the end of the day, this is a right that cannot be enforced. So that way of thinking about this problem, that you are thinking about it, that this is a right that I'm giving, but I don't have the money. So it's a kind of very standard, conservative, lawyerly way of looking at a problem. And my sense is that the slate that we had was clean. And at that point of time, that starting point could have been far more progressive than it was. And of course, the judges have made it progressive, and that's great, and great credit to them. But the starting point could have been very different. And that's what I argue in the book.
Here's my pushback somewhat on that. In the name of decolonization, which is very much a catchphrase, very much the political zeitgeist of the times we live in, and in the name of making things indigenous. So, for example, the India-Bharat debate, a debate anticipated to some degree by the architects of the Constitution who call our country both names. Is there a danger actually that the state becomes even more paternalistic, that the rights of the individual actually get subsumed? Because that is in fact the raging debate today. Even when you look at the caste census debate and the opposition gives a call of jitni abadi utna haq, the fact that policy should somehow be proportional to population, the right wing, the RSS talks of a Hindu Rashtra, the opposition is talking of, a sort of an OBC oriented new quota policy. Both are different aspects of majoritarianism. So my question to you is, in the name of decolonization, there are other dangers.
Absolutely. And decolonization is a big word. And I think we would be remiss if we didn't realize that decolonization has been a field of study for quite a period of time, as in not just in India, but in several parts of the global south. And when we can look at Frantz Fanon and sort of all the writing against colonialism, it's broadly been about the violence of the oppressor, which is essentially what colonialism is about. Now, obviously, now we are at a stage where decolonization can go in two ways, as you rightly pointed out. One is that there could be genuine decolonization of the kind that authors have talked about, and I've tried to talk about in my book, where we are looking at systems, as Gandhiji was trying to argue, of systems that are instinctive to India, of a smaller state that trusts its people, of citizens who owe civic duties towards each other, as idealistic as it may sound at this point of time. What we are seeing today in terms of decolonization is two things. One is the changing of names. And changing of names historically has been a stock in trade of decolonizers. And changing names is important. This is my considered view, that it's something that needs to be done in the right proportion at the right time.
Where do you come in on the India-Bharat debate? It's not even a debate anymore, because India, that is Bharat, is in the Constitution.
I think that is a non-debate, because India and Bharat are both names that can be used. I am Bengali. When I'm speaking Bengali, I say Bharat, and when I speak in English, I say India. So I actually don't see a conflict on this one. But there could be genuine conflicts around name changes, and whether it be Madras becoming Chennai or Bombay and Mumbai and so on, and there could be.
But the names of the courts remain unchanged. It's still Madras High Court.
Well, that's the original colonial legacy of our court system. But we can have a separate discussion on that. But what we are seeing with the criminal laws, and I think this is a very good example that you point to. I actually think, having read the bills in some detail, that this is a missed opportunity for decolonization. Because if we were to genuinely decolonize our criminal laws, which I think is necessary. Okay, so I like the impulse of wanting to decolonize our criminal laws. Our criminal laws are again based on the British notion that natives are liars and you need all kinds of minute legal prescriptions in order to control them. So I think there is room for decolonization. But why do I say it's a missed opportunity? Because I see that these bills have not done that. They have actually not decolonized it. In fact, it shows that how deep this colonial mindset is, that we actually have not done away with sedition. We have actually not trusted citizens more. We have actually not looked at ways indigenous to India, like mediated settlements for certain kinds of offenses or infractions. We have not looked at community service as ways of punishment. So my sense is that the impulse is good, but the manifestation of decolonization is superficial.
why are constitutional amendments that are provided for within the constitutional framework not sufficient to achieve this process of healthy decolonization?
No, I'm not saying they are not sufficient. They could be sufficient. See, whether to have a constitutional amendment or a new constitution is always a political call. So, like
But
in France,
are you in favor of a new constitution?
no, so at this point of time, as I've written very clearly in my book, we need to debate constitutional ideals. At this point of time, I am not in favor of a new constitution being written overnight. Okay, let me make this absolutely clear. Okay, but there are several parts of this constitution that require rethinking. And this is where I agree with what Vivek Devroy had written in that article, that the seventh schedule, the separation between the powers between the center and the states, there's a lot of rethinking that needs to be done, a lot of updating that needs to be done. So that's number one. And number two is that there are new ideas for a new India. So, for example, this is something that we cannot avoid, and I think we need to embrace, is the idea of duties. Now, whenever we think of duties, we think of some kind of paternalistic framework, right? Which is saying that, be good to someone, do this, do that. But that is because the way in which the 42nd Amendment introduced fundamental duties into the Constitution, we have that kind of idea that, we must stand up and respect the national flag. But Gandhiji had a much deeper understanding of duties. It was about the duties that we as citizens owe to each other, that the state owes to us as citizens. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done in trying to ensure that duties becomes a part of the constitutional framework.
But your argument is theoretical to the extent that it doesn't recognize the universal responses of politicians. Any politician wants a strong state. Any politician wants to minimize the rights of the individual. And therefore, you see sedition, right? I agree with you. You have provided valuable data on preventive detentions and how lakhs of people are placed in preventive detention and how that's that is simply preposterous. But sedition, we appeared to have political consensus. Finally, okay, sedition should go. You have a sort of redrawn IPC, but sedition simply comes in another form, something that Fali Nariman pointed out at your own book launch, that you change the name, it doesn't change the law, right? So decolonization cosmetically doesn't achieve anything, and every political party will want the model of a strong central government.
Yeah. So, Barkha, I think that first, let me be clear that this actually is a project that is for the next 50 to 100 years. So, in terms of timeline, I think we are talking about a wrong timeline. And if I were to put things in perspective, we are a 75-year-old democracy. At age 75 in the United States, there was a very bitter civil war that they were fighting over the issue of slavery. And I think that, so we are young. And the United States has reached a place in its politics where, right or wrong, there is one strong segment of the political establishment which believes in a small state, which believes that there should be greater freedoms. Of course, that's got its own set of complications. Yeah. But my sense is that this is not going to remain true in India for all times to come, that every government will want a strong union government, and every government will want to restrict rights of people. I think as democracy matures, one, there will be greater maturity of our politicians as well, number one. Number two, and I see this much more closely in the way in which we are shaping up before the 2024 general elections, is that you obviously have national parties and, one broadly national party, and then you have all kinds of federal formations, right? And I think that over a period of time, this is going to be a major axis of politics in India, whether with delimitation coming up, if the language issue gets further forced, and obviously with kind of differences of finances between center and states. I think this issue of what we call federalism, but broadly speaking, of India being a union of states, will become a major issue in politics going forward.
You remember the outcry when Rahul Gandhi described India to be a sort of, I'm quoting him loosely, but like a federation of states. That's very much the American idea. And in some ways, I think Indians maybe don't really believe in that idea. I'm generalizing here. Indians, there are as many Indians who believe in one thing and as many who believe in the opposite. But I put it to you that there's an inherent insecurity in India about this idea of the small state or a loose federation of states, because we are so diverse. We are so diverse that you need something to tie us together. And that idea of the republic was our constitution. And you take that away and perhaps there would be no modern Indian state.
Yeah, so I think that the idea of the republic is deeper than the constitution. And I say that that the founding moment of Indian democracy and this idea is a much older idea that has gone on for, I would say, close to 2000 years, but more recently through the freedom movement. And I think that's where India came together and was shaped into the nation that we know today. Number one. Number two, we came together at a time of partition. Both you and I come from partition states, so we know that how bitter that is and how we want to avoid that. And so the impulse of having a strong center at that point of time, as I write in my book, is very understandable. But as we mature as a state, I think that what will keep India united is the recognition of our diversity. This unity in diversity has become a kind of cliche, but I think it's cliche for a reason, that it's true. And I think that we need to ensure that we respect that diversity. And if India, God forbid, this were ever to happen, and I don't think it will ever happen, and I certainly hope it doesn't happen, but if there is, God forbid, some secessionist tendency in India, it will come not because of that diversity pulling us apart, but because of a forced unity from the center. And I think that's what we have to guard against.
What you mean effectively is empowering the states much more, so that there isn't a pushback of wanting more power. That here's a kind of question for you. If I look at some of the tenets of the Constitution, whether it's affirmative action, Article 370, the Constitution makers introduced certain articles thinking that there would be a finite time to them. It is actually politicians or politics that debased or corroded, or if you want, argued that no, the makers had it wrong. Actually, they were wrong. A new country needs much more than 10 years. A new country needs 100 years for affirmative action, right? So how do you see that debate when you talk about a colonial constitution? Actually, the architects of the constitution saw many things as transitory. It is politics that refuse to make them transition, which is what they were meant to be.
Yeah, so I think that there's a practical way of answering this question, and there is a kind of more academic way of doing it. So let me do the academic way practically. So I think the Constitution framers had a simple belief. They thought that now that Indians are running these institutions, Indians will run it with the public welfare in mind. So the fact that these institutions are colonial, the fact that the British used it as a tool of brutality is all in the past. But the fact is, people are not like that, right? People are good at times, people are bad at times, people are selfish, they are selfless, and politicians are the same. There's no reason to believe that politicians would act in some great national interest at all points of time. And this actually I find very strange, and I would say that and I would go so far as to say that the makers got it wrong here, because they were basing themselves on the US Constitution greatly. And if you look at the genius of the US Constitution, and we must understand this and give credit where it is due, lest we become insular, is that the US Constitution is based on a very simple idea that man is vile. Okay, man is looking out for himself, and there were no women at that point of time in their framers, so the women didn't feature much in their vision. But that was the idea. So what do we need? We need checks and balances. So if you are going to have an elected president, then you also have an elected Senate. Okay, so and then you check and balance each other. So this was the idea, because they know that individuals are basically self-interested. And the one person who realized it at that point of time, but retreated strategically, was Gandhi. Gandhi knew that this was the case, but he retreated because he realized that it would take a long time for people to become better versions of themselves. So he wasn't getting into this question of the Constitution. But the framers still believed, and it was a heady optimism of the time, that they believed that people would be good. And people are people, and we can see the impacts of that today.
Finally, if there's one thing that you would want to see immediately change in the Constitution, what would that be?
Well, I would like the preventive detention provision to go. I think for the simple reason, one, it's optically important. India doesn't need to put people in prison without any formal legal process, number one. And number two is that, and this is something the Prime Minister says all the time when he's talking about ease of living, and I fully agree with him, is that India cannot grow if the citizen and the state don't trust each other. The state has to trust its citizens. We can't always be filling up forms in triplicate and basing ourselves on the fact that the citizen is out to hoodwink the state. So like citizens have to be trusted, I think the state needs to walk its talk and ensure that citizens are not jailed without reason. And this would be a larger message that the state now trusts its citizens.
Fascinating conversation, Arghya Sengupta. Thank you. If you haven't read his book, do pick up a copy of the Colonial Constitution. Whether you agree or disagree, it will make you think. And I think that is the idea of all the best books. Thank you so much, Arghya. Take care.
Thanks, Barkha. Thank you.
Thanks. It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.